Hey, it's Drybear. And today I'd like to stop you from dying in Diablo 4. One of the comments that I see on stream and in YouTube comments and across the internet right now, which breaks my heart, is there are plenty of people out there saying that they're progressing towards late game, they've gone up in world tier, or they're trying to complete a capstone dungeon or a nightmare dungeon. They can't seem to kill anything, and they keep getting killed by monsters. And I've seen many people express frustrations in the form of, I'm just going to quit the game because I keep dying to random things that I don't know why. And I would hate to lose people that otherwise would love the game that are just getting stuck and hitting walls and not fully understanding how to make their character tanky enough to survive the onslaught of hell. So if this is you, don't worry, you're in the right place. I've got you covered. We're gonna go through all of the different ways you can make your character tankier. And at the end of the video, I'm gonna go through all of the major threats and enemy types you'll encounter, what to look for, and how to avoid getting hit by their mechanics that can easily one-shot you in the right scenario. But first, you should come by my live stream. I'm live every single day on twitch.tv/Drybear. If you don't come by and hang out with the community, then the next time you order a hot drink, tea, or coffee, you're gonna put about 90% of the sweetener or sugar you normally like, which means you're gonna be able to notice the difference, that it's not as sweet as you want, but it's not so far off that it makes you want to go back and add more. All right, let's begin on how to make your character not die in Diablo 4. We're gonna go through this rough format and talk through these aspects. So let's start with the first thing, which is going to be aspects that you can put on your gear as legendary powers. The first one to talk about is Disobedience. This is a defensive legendary and is one of the best legendaries in the game that you can use for defense, that comes with a caveat and you have to use it properly. There are builds that will be unable to use Disobedience, so if you're told this legendary is good and you use it but you're unable to stack it properly, you'll get less value and defensive strength than you would from a different legendary. This says that every time you damage an enemy, you get a percentage increase in your armor, up to a maximum of 50% if you have a max roll. This stack lasts for 4 seconds. So your character needs to be doing 100 instances of damage in 4 seconds to get the max value out of this. When it's fully stacked, it's actually insanely strong and almost impossible to match in any other form. But if you're a character that does burst, like a single target burst in one hit, or you're up against a boss where there's only one target on screen and you hit slowly, you'll actually get almost no value out of this legendary, but it is one of the best. So think about your build. If you have a lot of AoE, or you have a lot of attack speed, or you hit with multiple times, or you have dot effects, damage over time, get Disobedience and put it on your defensive pieces. Disobedience being a defensive aspect means that it can only be applied to your helm, your chest, your pants, your amulet, or if you can use a shield, it can be on a shield as well. So those are your options for putting it on there. And one thing you should think about when you're trying to make your character tankier is to really try to heavily invest in bare minimum your legs, your pants, and your chest being almost entirely defensive, because they have some of the best defensive stats in the game and sometimes can be only exist on those 2 slots. So make sure that at least your chest and your legs are both defensive options that can give you some really good survivability from that. The next aspect to talk about is going to be Protector, or of the Protector. This one is insanely good. It scales better if you have a build that focuses on barriers, but you don't have to be with a build that focuses on barriers to use it. It is insanely strong. Every 30 seconds, when you damage an elite enemy, you gain a barrier. This barrier value goes up based on what tier you found the power in. So if you're in Sacred tier and you're using a normal version, the value of the barrier is going to be lower, so you'll want to find a Sacred tier 3 item version of it. And same thing goes for Ancestral tier 4. You can actually get this up over 6,000, 7,000 HP on just the Protector, which is insanely good. And then even more if you put it on your amulet. Just like the Disobedience legendary, this is only available for helm, chest, pants, amulet. And if you can use a shield, it can go on shield as well. So that is an option for defense. And this one I think fits in every single build, even if you're not doing modifiers for barrier. But if you have a barrier-based build, it does even better, because you can, all the benefits that you have when your barrier is up will be applied. So think about putting this one. I personally like putting this on helm because there are better options for pants and chest that you'll want to have. And then you'll want to think about whether or not you put a defensive legendary on your amulet. In some cases, for some builds, you might want to. And the reason I say the last aspect as protector is because there's also a protecting legendary that does something different. And this one is actually a little bit of a bait, but if you know how to use it properly, it can be very strong. So what this does is that when you are damaged and you drop below healthy, which is 80% health, it will spawn an immunity bubble that you can stand in for up to 5 seconds or up to 8 seconds if you put it on your amulet. This will be a way for you to stand in the immunity bubble and stay away from damage. However, this can only proc every minute and a half. So I would say, in general, this one isn't as good, but if you have a build that can take full advantage of it, like say you have a burst build, or maybe you have some way to suck enemies in, most classes do, and you focus on some kind of combo setup, I would say for classes that have that kind, like Sorceress or Necromancer, in some cases Barbarian, where you're focusing on setup, or if you're like a trap-based rogue where you can really get a lot of value out of just going ham for a couple seconds, protecting can actually be pretty good for you. But if you're relying on this for survivability, especially as you push higher into the game, it just doesn't happen very often. So I would say focus on this only if you are using it for some kind of combo-based build. But I would definitely say that Disobedience and Protector are both more valuable in keeping your character alive. And the last goated aspect that I would talk about here is going to be Might. Most builds use this if they have a builder. If you have a basic skill, the first skill tree segment in your skill tree overall, this one is amazing because you can have up to 6 seconds or 9 seconds if you put on your amulet of 20% damage reduction. This is a global modifier. It reduces all damage by 20%. And as far as I can tell, this isn't even reduced by the DRs that damage reduction normally gets, unless you are already at the 85% damage reduction cap. So it means that if you have a max roll on this and it's not on amulet, every 6 seconds, as long as you're using your builder, your basic skill, you get 20% damage reduction. So you combine that with the 50% armor you get from Disobedience and the near full HP barrier that you can get from Protector. If you put all three of those together, you're already significantly more tanky and survivable than you were before. Now, there's going to be other options that are less valuable. There are things like the Crowded Sage, which I have found to be pretty weak. There's ways to stun enemies if they hit you. You can avoid damage. And there's also a bunch of class-specific legendaries that are pretty decent as well, and in some cases insanely strong. But rather than going through each class and all of their aspects, I wanted to keep this class agnostic to focus on that. So these four legendaries, Disobedience, Protector, Protecting, and Might, are ones I would consider putting into every single build that you make just to have it there because you'll want it. Now let's talk about your statistics, the ones that you care most about in order to make your character stronger. Not only are there important ones that every character needs if you plan to do any kind of difficult content, because you will be taking tons of damage, but also ones that can only appear on specific slots on your gear, which means that if you're using those slots, like chest or boots or legs or helm, for things that aren't defensive, it can really hurt you in the long run because you're doing damage, but you're dead, and everyone knows that a character that's dead doesn't do any damage. The first main stat to look at, since we already talked about Disobedience as a defensive legendary, is going to be your armor. This is one of your best overall stats. There are diminishing returns here, and you do get tons of value from running this, but it's very important that you have armor of a high value to keep yourself alive. This is a summary of many different stats in your defensive tree, and you can increase it directly by having it on gear, by putting skulls in your accessories, and through various effects like Disobedience, which is insanely strong. This one will give you a global physical damage reduction modifier, and it does contribute to your magical damage reduction as well, which makes it an insanely strong stat, and arguably the strongest stat for making your character more durable in the late game. So you want to have high values of this either through your build or just passively through the stats that you've acquired and placed onto your character. The next one is going to be your maximum life. This is insanely important, and there's only a few slots that can have this, and you want to consider running it on those slots if you want to survive. Similar to most of the defensive options in the game, they were going to come from your 3 primary defensive slots: your helm, your chest, and your pants. These can roll maximum life, and it's incredibly important that you try to get it if you can. Disregard the build. I'm still theory crafting a bunch of stuff, so these aren't kind of like proper endgame items. I've been testing a whole bunch of things, but you can get max life on helm, on chest, and on legs. You want to have it on here if you can support it and your build can use it for a few reasons. One, there are many effects in the game that calculate based on your current life or max life, and also you may require things like injured or healthy. If your total value of life is higher, that means that the range between 100% and 80% to maintain healthy contains more flat life, which means you can maintain that distance easier. And same thing goes for injured, especially if you're going to run damage reduction while injured. If the flat value of your life is higher, it means that 0 to 35% is more actual flat life, which means you can sit in injured longer, getting more value out of that damage reduction. On top of this, some of the enemy effects in the game, like poisons and toxins and things like that, can have calculations that are based on your max life. And so having more max life means that you can survive those better than just damage reduction or getting temporary effects like barriers and things like that. So you want to have enough max life. I would say you don't need as much as I have here. This is an overpower build that I'm theory crafting right now. So I would say that you'll probably get about 6,500 to 7,000 max life at base when you just level up. And then as you start adding more max life through helm, legs, chest, shield, and rings can also have max life on them. You probably want to get up to close to 8 to 10,000 for normal builds. If you're running an overpower build, you probably want 11,000 to 13,000 life, because that life not only makes you stronger and tankier, but it makes you do more damage as well. And the next thing to talk about is a hotly debated item in the community right now, and that is going to be your magical resistances. So let's put some light on this, because there's definitely a lot of people talking right now about how horrible these are and how useless they are. And part of that is true, but there should be some asterisks included in that, as it's not entirely true, it's just mostly true. So you have these different elements that you can gain resistance to. And you're going to face a lot of these when you go into high nightmare dungeons, especially in World Tier 4, where these effects can be absolutely devastating when you face them. The two worst ones are going to be cold resistance and poison resistance, as in like the most dangerous ones you'll face. And in many cases, lightning as well, because there are some lightning effects and affixes that can one-shot you if you're not paying attention. And it can be incredibly painful. However, the reason that these are so insanely hated on right now as a defensive option is because every time you go up in world tier and as you push higher and higher content, there are global penalties to these. And I would argue that the penalties right now are a little bit too severe, maybe even a lot too severe, because they nerf your resistances like crazy when you end up going into the highest difficulties right now. It was mentioned on the dev campfire chat that they want to investigate this because the penalty that you get global is so insanely harsh. And that's the reason why resistances are so poor and so low value right now, is because no matter what you put into these resistances, if that world tier 4 and high nightmare penalty exists as insanely high as it does right now, you're better off just putting points into things like armor and damage reduction that aren't so heavily penalized in the highest difficulty. I mean, if you're World Tier 1 and World Tier 2, resistances are actually insanely good. World Tier 3, they get pretty bad. And then World Tier 4, they get insanely bad just because they're so heavily nerfed and penalized for the difficulty that you get. In general, for gems on accessories, I would say you always want to run armor. There is a caveat that I will put there for one main thing, and I've been experimenting a bunch with this, using some diamonds, some specific resistances. I've been trying to theory craft and test out a bunch of stuff to see if I can figure out exactly what's wrong with it and what's going on. The only caveat that I will put on resistances for World Tier 4 and High Nightmare is if your cold resistance is too low, anytime you face cold walls or cold enchanted, you run the risk of being instantly frozen the second you get chilled. And I've found that you want to have at least like 35 to 45% cold resistance at minimum for like High Nightmare, because anything lower than that, if a touch of cold wind touches your toe, you instantly get hard stunned and there's nothing you can do. So you want to have at least a little bit, so it takes 2 or 3 applications so you have time to run away and reset on the High Nightmare. But in general, if you're talking about taking damage and surviving damage, your armor is going to be better for your accessories. and the resistances themselves have such low value. And I think they definitely need to look at this overall, because if we're going to go into World Tier 5 and beyond, if that penalty keeps scaling the way that it does, resistances are just going to become completely untenable, and any enemies we face that have elemental damage are just going to one-shot us forever, and it's not going to be a fun experience. So as of right now, you definitely don't want to invest in resistance. You will have inherent resistances on your rings and your amulet that come with the item, and you also will have the option to do resistances through gems on your accessories. And just kind of keep an eye on poison resistance and cold resistance. You want to have some of that, just because it is actually pretty dangerous if those status effects scale up too much. The damage itself, you're better off just getting armor and damage reduction to avoid the magical damage. But if they have an application of a status effect, you want to have some way to reduce that, which is pretty important. When it comes to other stats, these are the slots you want to care the most about, just laid out on screen so you can check them out and have them. So have these in your notes. These are on one of the documents I've been working on, but just so you have this here. Max life can exist on chest, ring, helm, pants, and if you can use one, a shield. So these 4 slots for most classes, chest, ring, helm, pants, you have the option of getting max life, and I would recommend that you do so if you plan to push hard content. Percent damage reduction is one of the best stats in the entire game. And I would argue that if you can, you want to put this on every single one of these slots. You want percent damage reduction on chest, percent damage reduction on pants, and percent damage reduction on amulet. And again, shield if you can use one. So you want to have these as options here, because these are global overall damage reduction. They only exist on these 3 slots. So you have to put them on these slots if you want to have survivability. And that's very, very important. You can even make this bigger for the people in the back. Damage reduction, chest, pants, amulet, and then optionally shield. Then we have other damage reduction options, which the value of these are going to be higher than the damage reduction flat, but they have a condition, which means that you want to pay attention to that. If you have a build that can generate, fortify, and maintain it, damage reduction while fortified becomes insanely powerful, because it gives you a high damage reduction modifier. If you didn't know, to become fortified, your current amount of fortify amount has to be equal to or higher than your current HP. So if you have full HP, you need full fortified to become status fortified. If you have that status, it means that you'll get that damage reduction, and it can be really high. This can exist on amulet, chest, pants, and then focus, shield. So an offhand that's defensive if you can use one. So those options are there if you want to pick those up. And then totem, I think, can drop this as well. So you have that option. So if you're going to use it on offhand that is utilitarian or defensive, you can put that there. Otherwise, you're going to need to get it from pants, chest, amulet. So like Barbarian and Rogue will have to get these from here, but the casters can use these to get extra amounts if they need it. So damage reduction while fortified is great if you're running a build that can maintain fortified. You're generating enough that you can more often than not be equal to or higher amounts of fortify than your current HP. Damage reduction from is a category that exists on a few item slots and can be exceptionally valuable when you are utilizing any kind of build that can be put into trouble. So damage reduction from works when targets are bleeding, affected by shadow damage over time, burning. You can also get damage reduction from close targets, which is most of the damage. The most dangerous damage you're going to take is from close. Damage reduction from distant, and then damage reduction from poisoned. So if an enemy is poisoned, if you have a build that uses poison, and you can put this on all targets, or you have a burning build from Sorceress or Sorcerer, or you have a bleeding build from Barbarian, you can get even more damage reduction from that. And these can exist on chest, pants, amulet, and shield if you can wear one. And then bonus armor, people don't know this. I actually don't see a lot of people utilizing this. We know how good armor is. You can actually get bonus armor on an item, and these only exist on pants, boots, and amulets. You can actually get even more survivability from your boots if you roll that on there. And keep in mind that these can exist on all of these slot items, and you can re-roll or enchant your items at the occultist to get these stats, so that not only are you getting tons of defense from all your stats normally, from your aspects, your legendary aspects, and all of that, but you're also getting a bunch of damage reduction and max life from all of your gear. And so if you're using your gear only for damage, and then you're getting one shot by everything, you really need to focus on these slots. Primarily helm, chest, pants, and amulet are the biggest ones. make sure that most of those, as far as you possibly can without gimping your build, include defensive options like max life, damage reduction, and armor as a part of your overall build. Some of the less viable but still useful stats that you can pick up for your build are going to be dexterity and strength. At base for all classes, regardless of what class you're playing, strength gives you more armor and dexterity gives you dodge chance. You can also additionally get bonus dodge chance on your gear. Dodge is kind of an interesting stat. Most of the time, it's not going to be super valuable, but if you have anywhere from 3 to 10% dodge, you'll be shocked by how many times this saves your life, where there's some long, like a corpse bow winds up a big one shot, shoots it at you and you dodge it, and it saves your run and prevents you from dying in a nightmare dungeon. It can be super useful. And if you find an item that isn't perfectly rolled, but you know, the fourth, like all three, there's 3 stats that are perfect for you, and the 4th stat is strength or dexterity, don't be super bummed. It still does give you defensive options. It gives you armor, it gives you dodge chance, and then you can also roll dodge chance on a few slots as well. Though if you're not going to make full advantage of the dodge, this is kind of just a freebie. If you can't re-roll it or it's an imperfect item, but you get the dodge, it can be very useful as well. Don't sleep on cooldown reduction either. Cooldown reduction is a slot that can very easily take over some really awesome survivability for your class. By the way, this cooldown reduction modifier applies to everything in your kit. Anything that has a cooldown, this applies to, including your evade. You can get it primarily from your helm, your amulet, and your offhand. So helm and amulet, you want to run it if you can. And there are some ways that you can get it on offhand, and you can also roll it on gloves. So just so it's all in the same setup here, helm, gloves, amulet, and then your offhand can roll cooldown reduction. And it does apply not only to your defensive skills and any ability that has a cooldown, but it also applies to your evade. So if you're running a evade stat on your boots that is reliant on cooldown, like not attack reset, but movement speed or multiple evades, having this is going to be super useful. And if you're also running a build, a lot of Sorcs run builds that have 2 or 3 defensive options. Barbarian builds will do this. Druid will have 2. If you have this in your build with multiple defensive skills, getting cooldown reduction on your helm, gloves, amulet, and potentially your offhand, if you can use one, can be super useful for keeping you alive and keeps that rotation of survival through your cooldowns much more reliable. Another option is healing received. And this one is, if you invest heavily into it, incredibly strong, but you have to have a build that utilizes it. I've tested a whole bunch on Temerity, on Crowded Sage, and the healing there. If you kind of dabble in it, it's really weak. These things that you can get, like you get Temerity, which can actually have some pretty good barrier values on it and scale up. You can also get Crowded Sage. Some of these are decent, but unless you invest heavily into it, like you have a heavy healing build, it can be pretty hard to manage. The build that I'm working on right now, this Overpower Blood Surge build, uses healing and Fortify like crazy, and it ends up being super valuable for me because I can get some value out of it. I can even get resource out of it from healing, but I wouldn't look at just dabbling in healing for like Crowded Sage or Temerity or things like that, just because it's going to be hard to get value. So think about your build. If it's a build that uses healing received, you may want to put it in there, but otherwise, other options for armor, damage reduction, health, CDR is even going to be more valuable if you're not insanely invested in healing received. Another thing that I would consider is what gems you put in your armor. So your pants, your chest, your helm, and optionally your shield if you can use one. So you have those options there for putting in gems. If you are using a Overpower or Fortify build, I would recommend getting maximum life. This says %, it is additive. It's same thing as the Paragon board, it is additive. So rubies are good in your armor for giving you maximum life. I would actually recommend for most builds, if you're not sure, to run Topaz. This is one of the best defensive options you have for your armor. It says that when you are crowd control impaired, damage reduction gets applied. And if you get high, these royal topazes in the 5 slots you have available, 2 in legs, 2 in chest, and 2 in helm, you can get some significant damage reduction if you ever get put on anything in the crowd control category, including slows, but not limited to freezes, stuns, fears, things like that. And that's usually when your character dies, when you get feared into some position that's bad, or you get stunned and then you know, a big snake's winding up a one-shot and there's nothing you can do, getting topaz in your gear can be super useful for that. The other option is going to be damage reduction while fortified. This is actually, it's a low value, but it's super nice if you have high fortified values. I would say if you're running a DPS build that's non-overpowered, but you have lots of fortify, sapphires in gear become super valuable. It's insanely good damage reduction while you're fortified. But again, if you're running an overpower build, you may want to consider running rubies just for the extra health and damage that you get from that. But if you're doing fortified DPS non-overpower, then the sapphires and armor become super useful. Then we already talked about accessories. Armor, skulls are going to be your best bet. In some small cases, you may want to run cold resist to avoid being frozen. But I find very little value in doing diamonds just for the overall percentage, just because of the global modifier and penalty that exists on resistances right now. The next thing I want to talk about is the crowd controls that you will face, because you will face a lot of them the higher you go. Anything past Nightmare 50 and crowd controls are usually going to spell your doom. It's just the style of the game, the way the end game is. I've made videos about it, going over how ridiculous the crowd control is and how necessary Unstoppable is for every single build. But let's talk about some of the most threatening crowd controls that you'll face. The first one is going to be stuns. And in just a minute, we'll go over all of the mob types that are the most dangerous for you, so you know what these are. The cannibals have big stuns. The revenants have big stuns. You can get stuns from the blacksmiths. You can get stuns from the large snakes. Any of these stun effects can kill you very easily, especially if you're not running topaz in your armor, and you got to be aware of these. Freezes are also very difficult to deal with. The primary ways you're going to get frozen are going to be with the cold puddles on the ground, cold walls that get spawned, or cold enchanted enemies. Puddles are dangerous because they build up and they actually do tons of damage while you're standing on them, so you have to get out of them ASAP, especially on high difficulty. They will kill you in a matter of, you know, half a second or a second if you're standing in it. Cold enchanted can be rough, especially on like the abominations that have that lunge attack where they can keep up with you and they keep lunging and lunging and lunging. They'll just keep freezing you and you'll die. And then cold walls are the big walls that get put up by elites as an affix. These get exceptionally dangerous if you're in a tight area like Core Dragon or Renegade. You can get caught in really tough situations where you can actually, like say I was over here by this wall. If you're standing here by this wall and you know that you're up against cold walls, like if you see there's cold walls there, you want to be very careful, because what can happen is if you're close to any blockable collision, the cold walls can actually spawn in like a crisscross pattern on top of your character. So I would say if you recognize that there's cold walls or you see cold walls, look for open space, stand out in the open so the cold walls have a way to spread out. Otherwise, you can get instantly frozen by the fact that the cold walls will just spawn on top of each other repeatedly and you just get completely frozen. I hope they address this in the future. It's kind of ridiculous that this is the way that it is. But again, if you see cold walls, avoid standing near any collision and try to look for open space, or you will get instantly frozen. The other danger is fear. You'll see these curse marks on the ground. It's like this little, like, you know, Full Metal Alchemist sigil with like curse lines and stuff on it. And you'll see like a skull in the middle and it's like scary. That looks like a pig. I don't know. You'll see these red things on the ground. If these go off while you're standing on them, you get feared, and in many cases, you will just get killed if you get feared. Pretty bad. Another huge negative is spiders for the immobilized. There are a few routes in the game. The most egregious of the immobilizes is going to be spiders, and generally I try to avoid dungeons that have spiders unless you are like a barbarian or a druid that has high amounts of unstoppable in your build. You may even be running a druid or barbarian build that doesn't have perma unstoppable, and then spiders become absolutely ridiculous. Each one of them, even the little baby spiders, will put out a little web that they put on the ground. It's a little deployable trap. And if they spawn them in such high frequency that they'll just be everywhere, especially if you get a high density pack of spiders. And every time you touch one of these, you get instantly rooted, and you can get rooted inside of a daze field, which silences your character. There's nothing you can do. You can get rooted in front of an AoE. You can get rooted in front of a one-shot. You can get rooted in front of a wraith projectile. You can get rooted in front of a snake that's about to one-shot. You can get rooted in front of a revenant that's about to stun. Spiders are insanely dangerous in this game, and I would treat them with the utmost respect. because if you don't, they will absolutely kill you. And the next thing you want to be careful of in general is going to be jailers and wallers. And for the same reasons that we want to be careful of cold walls, if you stand near collision, so like we're over here standing near this wall right now, I've actually had this happen where like if the waller is here and they always create this U shape where they trap you in with them at the end and you here, if you are close to a wall, sometimes these wall segments can spawn on top of each other and get really janked up. And I've actually had them like, I've been right here standing in between them and I was perma-stuck and couldn't get out. So again, if you find cold walls or you find jailers or wallers, look for open areas, go in the open space and fight them. If you have to run away and fight somewhere else, do so, because it's going to keep you alive and it's going to be a lot safer for you if you manage it that way. Next, let's talk about affixes to be aware of. Some very dangerous ones in here that can kill you off if you're not paying attention and are super difficult to deal with as you push higher and higher. This website, by the way, is diablo4.cc. You can see it up here in the corner. It's a kind of a repository database of a lot of things, and I use it for a lot of things, so you may want to check this out as well. So chilling wind, we talked about this. This creates the walls that are very, very dangerous. Cold enchanted is a nasty one, especially if you're going down into any of the desert dungeons that have the abominations with the lunge attack, and especially at high levels when they move really fast, it can be insanely painful. Shock Lance is really scary. Lightning Enchanted is really scary, but the one that I found to be the scariest is actually Electrified Obelisks. So the way Electrified Obelisks work is it will spawn 5 obelisks. So it'll kind of create an obelisk, and generally it tries to do a pentagram. So it'll create them in a pentagram way, and then it'll just randomly shoot these lightning projectiles in between all of the obelisks, and they hit really hard. But the reason this is super dangerous, just like Jailer, just like Chilling Wind, is if you're inside of an area space or you're up against a wall, what can happen is it can create obelisk, 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 obelisk. And you could be standing in the middle of this. And so it goes, screw you, you're dead, I kill you. And there's just laser beams everywhere and you get insta-shot. So again, if you're inside, look for open space. These Electrified Obelisk is insanely scary. It can do tons of damage, and one of the reasons why you want to kind of keep an eye on your lightning resistance, because it can really, really kill you. Explosive is rough, but pretty easy to deal with if you're paying attention. Fire Enchanted is actually one of the affixes that I hope that they change for 2 reasons. One is you actually, any enemy that's Fire Enchanted, you have an enemy here, it will pick 3 random directions to shoot projectiles in always. The reason I don't like this is because the way it chooses, and depending on the type you're facing, the type of enemy that this enemy is, it can become almost impossible to deal with. So if this is a slow-moving enemy, not a big deal. Just pay attention to the lines and position yourself in a way where you're not going to get hit by them. It changes every couple seconds. These will like find new directions to go into. So you'll want to kind of pay attention to that. But the problem comes when Fire Enchanted shows up on fast-moving enemies. Because again, if you get like an abomination or a swarm, or you get one of the dashing snakes that move really, really fast, what happens is the snake or the abomination can be here, and it ends up randomly generating a direction for the Fire Enchanted that's directly at you. And you have nowhere else to run but this way. Like you're in a hallway, it's just going to keep pulsing fire damage in your direction, and there's nothing that you can do, and you can't outrun this enemy, and it just keeps pulsing and pulsing and pulsing. And on High Nightmare, it just 1 or 2 shots you if you get hit by them. So it's really, really rough. So you want to be careful about if you see an enemy that's Fire Enchanted that is moving very quickly, try to get to a safer spot, reposition, or go around or get behind it. And then just be aware that when you kill Fire Enchanted, they will die and explode, which is pretty rough. Frozen is pretty straightforward. It's the orbs on the ground. You want to avoid these. These just tickle for a lot of damage, but they're pretty easy to avoid if you're paying attention. Mortar is overall pretty easy to deal with, but again, if you're in a packed, tight space, you can get rained on, and this is why you need immunities of some kind or damage reductions of massive amounts so that you can avoid getting absolutely brutally murdered by this. Multi-shot isn't a problem except for a few enemy types. There's some ranged enemy types that if they get multi-shot, it can be very, very painful. Plague Bear sucks. It does so much poison damage. And Poison Enchanted can get rough if there's an enemy type that doesn't move very much. So if you get like the Dread Knights, like the big, tall, mechanized Gundam armored dudes that don't really ever move all that much, they can drop like 3 to 5 poison enchanted puddles on the ground. And sometimes you just have to wait for them to fade out before you can go in, especially if you're playing a melee specific character. Shadow Enchanted isn't too bad, though I found Shadow Enchanted and Multi-Shot together can be pretty annoying. Summoner isn't too bad unless the enemies that they're summoning are pretty annoying. They can summon like Fallen Lunatics that explode, or the Bloat Corpses, Bloat Fiends that can be really annoying as well. Suppressor is probably one of the most annoying affixes in the entire game. And the way this works, if you don't know, is actually, I brought this up so that we can see it. This one is Suppressor. So the way this works is there's an enemy in the middle here, and it draws this bubble around them. If you don't know how this works, it's probably pretty confusing at first, but the way this is it's like an electric field. You have to be standing physically inside the suppressor to deal damage to the target. So for projectiles, this makes perfect sense. It's very obvious. So if you're like a ranged class and you're shooting, it'll hit this little part of the bubble. You'll get like a dunk failed sound that it makes, and the projectile will be destroyed by the bubble. But this gets more confusing when you're playing classes that have channeled abilities or ground-based abilities. In general, the rule of thumb with Suppressor is that if your character is not physically standing inside of the bubble, all of your damage goes to 0. This counts for things like Whirlwind. So if your Barbarian starts spinning inside of the bubble and then steps out, your Whirlwind stops doing any damage, even if you have active effects inside the bubble. Same thing goes for puddles like miasma, explosions, things like that. They'll start doing 0 damage if it detects that your character is outside the bubble. So you have to go inside to get deal damage. This becomes a major problem if you have things like the Malwood Treants, who have like the world's biggest arm. So if you have like the Treant that's here and their arm spans the length of the suppressor, and on Nightmare 60 and above, it will probably one-shot you if you get hit by their melee attack. So you have to come in, hit them, and then run out right before they swing and come back in and do that. So depending on your build, it can be really annoying. Suppressor is pretty bad, and for some builds, I recommend just avoiding Suppressor as an affix because it can be absolutely devastating when you run into it. Teleporter is pretty rough if they have other like lightning enchanted or cold enchanted, because they'll blink on top of you and attack instantly. And also the teleport itself does a lot of lightning damage as well. Chaos is the fear on the ground. Hellbound isn't too bad if you pay attention to it. Vampiric can almost be a sigil brick. It can actually, I've had some sigils where it bricked it because the mob that I was facing was like a high burst damage mob, and every time they hit with Vampiric, they would heal to full. And so it got to the point where unless you could one-shot them, you couldn't actually kill them. In general, it's not too bad, and especially if you're playing a class that can kite and avoid damage, you can actually just kill them off. But again, if it's like a Revenant that can charge at you, or a Treant, if it ever hits anything, or especially if you're running a minion build where you can't stop them from life stealing, Vampiric can be kind of annoying. Tempest is pretty annoying as well, and then Waller is only bad really if you have a class that can't deal with it, or if you're inside dealing with that. And just so I can make sure everyone's prepared leaving this video, let's talk about some of the more dangerous mob types in Diablo 4. I'm just going to use pictures because it's faster than trying to find footage of every single one. And I'll go through why they're the most dangerous and why you need to pay very close attention to not only their positioning when they appear, but also their animations so you can keep yourself alive. First, let's talk about these big cannibal dudes. Of the cannibal mob set, this is probably the only one that you have to keep constant mental awareness of. And it's mainly because when they do what you're seeing on screen right now, when they raise their arms and put both their weapons behind their head, they'll then start walking around like this. You need to get away from them immediately and never, ever, ever, ever be in melee range. They will, if you kite them around long enough, they'll put their weapons back down, and then you'll be safe again. But as long as they're walking around with their hands in the air like this, like they just don't care, you're in a lot of trouble. Because if you ever get in melee range of them, they will slam both their weapons down and instantly stun you. On Nightmare 70 plus, this usually one-shots you if you get hit by it. And if you don't get hit by it, you're stunned for a couple seconds, which is really bad. So if you get high density and cannibals are the mob set you have, pay attention to these dudes. If their hands go up, even if you're focusing on their things, I would recommend just disengaging, paying attention, waiting for them to drop, or killing them from range, and then getting back in, especially if you're playing a melee build. Do not get hit by this move. When it comes to the cultists, there isn't really any of the mobs in here that are exceptionally dangerous. These kind of shirtless, hooded dudes can be kind of annoying, and they have kind of a forward projectile attack, which is really annoying. But in general, none of them are all that dangerous. They just are relative to the difficulty you're doing. They could do a lot of damage, but there's not any like major avoid this kind of mechanic. Next, for the drowned mob set, most of these are fine. I would say almost all of these are fine. Big girl, little dudes that run around, the guys that kind of go for melee, and even the cultist looking dudes, all of those are relatively fine. The damage they deal is relevant to the level of difficulty that you're doing. The ones you want to be very scared of are going to be the drowned marauders. Specifically, if it's not this variant, they have a few variants. The variant of these that you want to be aware of is when they're holding a giant log. So if in their hands they have a giant like shipwright or log in their hands, you need to be very aware and very scared, because they have a special move where they will actually pick up their log and then slam it. And then, so if you're standing, like say you're standing right here, or saying the enemy's standing right here, it'll be a giant crashing wave that goes in all directions around, and it's pretty massive. It's all probably about half your screen, or maybe a little bit less when that goes out. It'll do a bunch of damage, and it also knocks back. So this one on high difficulties can one-shot you. It can also two-shot you, or it can knock you back into a giant tree ant that one-shots you as well. It can be really dangerous. So in general, the drowned aren't too bad. Just be aware of these big marauder dudes, especially if they're holding a giant log. When it comes to fallen, you want to be careful of two main enemy types. Obviously be aware of being swarmed by them. Obviously be aware of the shamans that resurrect. You want to kill the shamans in the back. But the two that you really want to be scared of are these fallen overseers. They have this jump slam attack with their axe. On high difficulties, it can do a ridiculous amount of damage. It's not as bad as the big goat men, but it still hits really hard. So just when you see these big overseers, just be aware that when they do that wind up attack, you want to be out of the way. And next is the fallen lunatics. These come in various different elemental affixes. They can be cold, they can be lightning, they can be fire. In general, most of my deaths, I feel like, are from not noticing that there was a fallen lunatic in the pack and it was going to blow up. So these have a very obvious AoE when it goes around. Usually it's like kind of this little zappy ring that goes around them as they're about to blow up, depending on what affix they have. But if you get hit by this on most difficulties, it is a one-shot. You have to be very aware. They're pretty fast. Unfortunately, for like necromancers, they don't even create a corpse if they die on their own. But you just got to be aware of these, especially if these spawn with nightmare portals. Nightmare portals is an affix for sigils where a portal will spawn, and then like 5 to 6 enemies will pour out periodically. Sometimes that mob type can be fallen, and sometimes that can spawn 2 to 3 lunatics, and you can have lunatics appear on you when you don't have the fallen mob type on that sigil, and it can easily one-shot you. So be wary for these guys. Next is the vampires or the ghouls. These are overall pretty fine, and I actually do enjoy getting these mob types, except for 2 specific mobs inside of these, and you can already see one of them on screen, and I'm sure for many people this is some PTSD triggering stuff. And that is the Revenants here. It's the Revenants and the Maguses, but the Revenants primarily. So the Revenants have a few attacks that are really annoying. One is they will lean down and lay their greatsword forward, their claymore forward, and they'll go for a big lunge attack. This one is insanely dangerous because not only is it a dash, so if the Revenant's here and he does the attack, he'll launch himself forward. If you get hit by it, it will stun you for a long time. It's like 4 or 5 seconds unmitigated. It is insanely long, and on high difficulties, it usually means that you're going to die. And depending on the affix they have, they might full heal from vampiric, they might instantly freeze you with high chill application. If they're cold enchanted, they might put, I've had Revenants put like 4 health bars worth of poison on me from a single dash attack that I ended up surviving, but I literally had to keep healing and healing. I'd use all of my potions to get through the amount of poison they applied with that attack. It's absolutely insane. When you see these guys, give them some space. And when they do their lean down, where they put their sword forward and they're winding up, get out of the way. Do not be anywhere in front of them. They're about to hit you. The other mob to be aware of in this mob type is going to be the Magus, which is the teleporting mages. In general, they're not too bad. They just have a ranged attack and they'll teleport around a lot. However, they can get very problematic depending on what affix they have. So if they have like suppressor, for example, where they'll blink around a bunch, like so if this is the mob and they have suppressor on them and you're inside the teleporter, they can blink far away and now all of a sudden the suppressor's over here and you have to chase them again. Also, they can spread a lot of like poison enchants or lightning enchants or obelisks in really weird spots. And they can get really, really annoying if you don't deal with them. And they can also keep up with you if you try to skip them as well. So be aware of those. They're not as dangerous as the Revenants, in my opinion, but they definitely can be depending on what affix they have. For the Goatmen, there are actually I would say Goatmen is probably one of the most annoying mob types to go against. They have some, most of the Goatmen actually aren't that dangerous at low difficulty. So if you're leveling in tier 1 or tier 2, or you're kind of just getting into tier 3, you may not think the Goatmen are all that dangerous. But as you push higher and higher, this mob type becomes one of the most deadly that you can face for a few reasons. One, these big axe-carrying mother truckers have this giant axe. They have a giant jump attack, this jump smash that they do. And it is terrifying. So they'll actually run up, they'll do this jump attack where they'll put the axe over their head and slam down in front of them. The reason this is annoying is that these guys can show up in higher numbers than Revenants or some of the Marauders for the Drowned. So that instead of just 1 or 2 you're facing, you can be facing 4 or 5 or 6 that are all repeatedly doing jump attacks over and over and over. It does stun you and it does ridiculous damage. So sometimes if you get caught in a doorway and 4 of these Goatmen are doing jump attacks at the same time, there's nothing you can do. You're just going to salute 07 as you go down because you're just dead. So this one is really rough for that. And you also want to be aware of the Impalers, the ranged guys. These guys here on the top, they are super annoying. They do high physical damage, and they also, if they're cold enchanted, you get frozen a lot. It's pretty rough. They do a lot of damage. So just like with the skeleton mob type, you want to try and clear out the ranged guys if there's a lot of them, because you can very easily get caught out. And the one that I think people don't realize until they start pushing higher content is the Goatmen Shamans. I wrote these guys off. I thought they were the weakest, most useless mobs. You just go over and kill them. They're not like the fallen shamans that resurrect. And so, it's not a big deal. It's a big deal. These guys are terrifying to deal with for a few reasons. Firstly, they will do this move right here where they put their staff in the sky and they start channeling. They can buff a teammate of theirs, another Goatman, and start channeling like lightning coming out of them, and that does insane damage at high nightmare. So you want to try and avoid them or kill them. So this one is the first one. But the one that I learned the hard way many times is they actually have like this very small volley attack that they'll do. So they'll actually kind of put their staff up and slam it, and they'll create all these like tiny little elemental like orbital drops in one spot. They're hard to see. They're very small, but on high difficulties, these hit like a truck, and in many cases will one-shot you. So if you're ever going against Goatmen and you are up against a shaman and you die and you're like, what did I just die from? And you look down in the chat and it says that your character died to a Goatman shaman, it was probably this attack. They do this little like barrage that comes down. It's like, honestly, it's like this big relative to them. It's very small. It's hard to see, but if you get hit by it, it will do significant damage for you on higher difficulties, especially if it's an element that your character is particularly weak to. So be wary of the Goatman Shaman. Next, let's talk about the Scourge of Diablo 4, the snake mob type that you get through Wild Water, whatever it is. There's like 3 or 4 dungeons that are just abominations. They are the worst place to be. These are some of the worst mobs that you can face in any dungeon. And there's some encounters that you'll get into where you get locked into a room with them and you just accept your fate. You salute as you go down because it's just terrible. So let's talk about the snakes. These snakes are insanely powerful. The most dangerous of these are going to be these big boys right here. I call them like the Hydralisk snakes because they have these big fangs that come out. But you have 2 main attacks you want to worry about with these snakes. The first one is they do this lunge attack where they will lurch back and then strike forward. If you ever see them do this, you need to get away from them immediately. Because not only does this usually apply a large amount of poison damage, it also stuns you if you get hit by it, and it does insane direct damage. And anything like 70, 80 plus, it will probably just one-shot you outright if you get hit by this. It's insanely dangerous, so never be in melee range of these guys if you can help it. You can also get hit by their charge attack. What they'll do is they'll spin in a circle like a dog doing a trick. Like they'll just twirl around like they're doing a fancy little move. And then once they're done with that little twirl, they'll lunge forward really fast. And this actually has turning to it. Like they have handling and they can turn. There's a turn radius limitation to how much they can rotate on this, but they can turn. So if you see this and you sidestep it a little bit, they might curve and hit you. If you get hit by the charge, it will stun you again. There's just more CC in this kit for some reason. It'll stun you and do significant damage, and this can easily kill you if you're in a pack of like a whole bunch of these snake mobs, and then one in the back twirls and dashes through the pack and comes out ahead and spearheads you. You can easily just die from that outright. Pretty rough. They're also really annoying on High Nightmare because they move incredibly fast, and if they're cold enchanted or poison enchanted, they can very easily kill you. There's also a very special version of these that come in like these champion mob sets you want to be very careful of. I don't face it very often. I feel like it only appears in 1 or 2 of the snake dungeons that you can do. But when you face them, you want to be very aware that they're there because they have a helicopter move attack. It's the weirdest things. They like raise both their arms in the sky and then they run forward. And then they just start like, you ever see a kid on the playground that gets into a slap fight? They do that. They just literally just start doing this. Like they just start stabbing repeatedly and chasing you over and over and over. It's like this channel chainsaw attack and it will kill you so fast. You can outrun it if they don't have any movement modifiers on them, and it's pretty rare, but when you run into it, you want to recognize it when it's there and try to keep some distance because it does ridiculous damage. And the other thing you want to be aware of is in this mob type, there is a mob called an oracle. It is the casters of this. They will periodically summon an eyeball next to them. And you want to be aware of this because when the eyeball appears, like this little floating eyeball that stands next to them, after a couple seconds, this eyeball is going to fly to somewhere else randomly in the room, stop, and then project a cone at you. If you're in this cone, whether you're looking at it or not, you will be instantly stunned. If you have high density of the oracles, I've had like 5 or 6 oracles on screen at once, and they all spawned eyeballs at once. And then you have this situation where you just have cone and cone and cone, and they're all stunning you. And these guys are lunging and attacking and charging and stunning and doing their chainsaw attack and stunning. And there's just stuns every half a second forever, and you're just CC'd into oblivion. That's why this mob set is so bad. Just be aware that when you get the oracles, first look for the eyeball. It does give you a warning before it spawns. I used to think that it doesn't. It definitely does. They'll spawn an eyeball. It'll float next to them like a familiar. And then after a couple seconds, it'll fly out. So look at the oracles. Check for an eyeball. When you see the eyeball, you know a couple seconds later that this stun is coming. Keep in mind that this stun will keep tracking. It doesn't like choose a direction and then stop and shoot. It will keep tracking for like a second or two. And so if you sidestep it, it'll reposition and shoot at you again, or shoot at you for the first time. It'll like track and track and track and track and then stop. I wish they just chose a direction and shot, but no, they have extra moments of tracking that they'll do to try and hit you. It's pretty rough. Next, let's talk about the corpse bows. I love these guys. They're very friendly and fun, and they have good personalities. They show up in the undead mob set, and I feel like they need to be changed because they're this walking artillery unit. So they can get up and walk and then reposition and sit down. They are like an anti-tank in placement. They are insanely powerful. They will shoot this big fat arrow that on high difficulties will usually one-shot you or 2 or 3-shot you if you have really good defenses. And it's dangerous because the way they work right now, and I hope that they change this in the future, is that they can actually prime their shot off screen. So they can actually be like idle in a room that you haven't entered yet, and their shot is already primed, which means that you can open the door and they can instantly fire and hit you right in the forehead and kill you on the spot, or they can walk off screen as you're kiting, and then they have it ready, and the second their foot or their toe comes on the screen, you still can't see them. All you can see is the pixel that is their toe on the top of the screen. They fire. You couldn't see them at all. You get hit by this giant projectile. It's even worse when they get modifiers on them, like cold enchanted, or even like shadow enchanted or lightning enchanted. It can be really rough. They can seriously do damage to you. So you want to kill these guys on sight. What I found best on these is either kill them as fast as possible or stand right next to them. It's kind of like a Dark Souls boss where they have slow rotation. So if you're a class that can move quickly enough and get next to them, you can just damage them and then stutter step around them because the way they rotate is pretty slow. But if you're anywhere further away from them, you have to either kill the mobs in front of them and then get to them and kill them fast, or just be aware that they exist. corpse bows are the actual worst. Luckily, they're like the only major problem in the undead set. The crossbowmen, if they're in large numbers, can be dangerous, especially if they spread out in a room and you're on a high difficulty. They can do a lot of physical damage. And then these big axe marauders are kind of annoying too, because they do this big wind up slam attack, which is very easy to dodge. But if you don't see it coming, or it's in a dense pack and you didn't see it, it can very easily come down and one-shot you as well. You want to be very careful about these guys, but in general, the corpse bows are the biggest problem. Next, we can talk about my favorite mobs in the entire game, the spiders and the spider hosts. These things are, if these don't get nerfed in the next year, I don't even know. I don't know anything. I'm just going to, I don't know, just perish and fade away. So these are actually these are the actual worst. These guys are actually horrible to go against because they do so many bad things. First of all, the spider hosts are a body with a spider on top. They do really good melee damage, but they're pretty slow and easy to avoid. When they die, they have a big explosion around them that can one-shot you. If it doesn't one-shot you, it'll knock you back, and sometimes knock you back into even worse situations. But when they die, they explode. This big spider on top of them jumps off, and then a bunch of little spiders will come out as well. The reason these suck so much is because any spider, even the little baby ones, can create those immobilizing traps on the ground. And they're also insanely good. If you didn't know, on the higher difficulties for Diablo 4, one of the modifiers they use to make the game more difficult is they make the AI smarter and more aggressive and with a higher hustle. So with High Nightmare, especially in World Tier 4, these mobs get incredibly accurate with their projectiles, and they'll actually do predictive movements as well. So if you're like moving like this, the spider will shoot the web in front of you and you'll run into it. If you don't change directions often, and it can just be, if you're not a class that has a lot of unstoppables, it can be insanely dangerous for you. So for spiders, I recommend taking your time. Don't over pull. Like try just one pack at a time until the spiders are dead. If there are spider hosts in the pack, which there usually are, make sure that you kill all new spawning spiders before you move on to the next pack. Nightmare dungeons right now aren't timed, so it's better if you're pushing High Nightmare to just deal with all the spiders, get rid of them. And I've even found it pretty useful as well to try and step on the immobilizing after a fight in case I have to kite backward. I don't get stuck in those traps, but you really want to try and burn them down as fast as you can because they are insanely dangerous. And the other ones you want to be careful about are the spider spitters. These are really annoying because on High Nightmare, their projectiles do insanely high damage. What they'll do is they'll shoot like 3 or 4 volleys in a row, like it's like a machine gun, like bop, 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 bop. These can be elementally infused, like the one you see pictured here is cold enchanted. So this can freeze you if you get hit by a couple of them. And one of the dangers, just like the hedgehogs in the wild mob set, is that if you end up getting caught standing right in front of them and you get hit by every single projectile, it can usually just one-shot you. They do crazy damage. So when you see the spitters, your priority is to deal with any active spiders that are chasing you in fast. So when I see a spider pack, I usually will pull it back. All the fast spiders that keep up with me, I burn them all down. I try to keep track of all the immobilizers that are on the ground, all the web traps. Then my next priority is to deal with the spitters, get the spitters out of here because they do insane damage and they apply affixes and status effects. Get those down. And then lastly, I'll kill off the spider hosts, which are pretty slow. You can kite them. And then you deal with the spiders that they spawn and move that in that order. But these guys can be dangerous if you're not paying attention to them as well. And the last mob set I'll talk about is going to be the wild mob set or the forest mob set. You'll get this in Mallwood or Wraithwind or Feral Den. And this is probably, if you don't have good damage reduction, this is one of the mob sets that might actually be impossible for you to do. I feel like these are probably going to get nerfed at some point, but this mob set for physical damage specifically is actually out of control. I honestly would recommend avoiding a lot of like Mallwood, Wraithwind. They are just so scary. So the first ones is going to be the ones we already talked about, the tree ants. These guys have a massive melee range. They can swing about this far on your screen. So if you're standing here and you get hit by one of their melees, in many cases it can 1 or 2 shot you. It hits incredibly hard. Generally, these are okay. You can kite, time it out. They turn slowly and they have a slow wind up. But if there's multiple of them, it can be annoying. Or even worse is if they have suppressor on them and you have to go in melee range. It's just the worst combination because you're in their swing range. And if you get hit by it, you'll just die, which is pretty annoying. You also have these wargs, which aren't really a big problem. The big problem, there's 2 other mobs in this mob set that are a huge problem. I'll give a special mention to the bears because they're actually pretty tough. They have a very short, medium lunge that can be very dangerous, but they're actually pretty easy to kite and deal with if you run into them. So the bears are definitely there. You'll also run into these like blacksmith dudes. I actually am not sure what mob type they belong to. I'm pretty sure it is the wild mob type, but they show up everywhere. I've seen them in all kinds of mob types. These guys are annoying because they do this like big hammer slam attack that can stun you and one-shot you, especially if you're facing them in like Core Dragon or like Renegade inside. They can be very scary because they'll do that wind-up attack, so you want to be aware of them. As far as I can tell, they can show up anywhere. But along with the treants, the other major danger is going to be the porcupines. These things are horrifying. One of the scariest mobs in this entire game. So what they do is they shoot like this triple burst fire shot of spines. On high difficulties, this does insanely high damage. The best way to deal with these porcupines is if you can, keep a large distance from them so you have time to dodge. Just like with the spider spitters, if you're standing right in front of them and you get hit by the whole volley, especially if they're either an elite porcupine or there's multiple, you can just die instantly. Like if you ever face the wild mob set and you walk into a pack and die instantly and you look down and it's one of the, what are they, spine monsters or spine fiends or something, spike fiends, then you'll know why. It was their volley. Especially if the volley is cold enchanted or poison enchanted, it can be insanely scary. So keep distance on these guys, chip them down if you can, if you're a class that can do that, or try to CC them and then go in for the kill, because their projectiles are very scary. And enemy number 1 in a lot of cases is going to be the pigs, the tusk chargers. These guys are, I think they need some updates on how their collision works, but they have 2 very scary attacks. The first one, as their name Charger would suggest, is they buck a little bit and then they charge forward. What's scary about this is the hitbox is not very clear. It's actually a little bit bigger than they are when they're charging. And when they get to where they're going, they'll thrash a little bit. So I've actually dodged the charge and then been killed by the follow-up thrash, or they'll turn around and then thrash again, and that melee attack can do crazy amounts of damage. So you want to give these guys a wide berth. If they show up on your screen, you want to have all eyes on them, pay attention to where they're charging, and then kind of get out of the way. It does go straight. Once they're done bucking, they will go in a straight line. What's scary is when you get collisions like these that are like curved, sometimes they'll aim at this and then slide and then keep going afterwards, which means that like you could be standing here, you see that they have the charge, and you look at the line, you're like, okay, that's not going to hit me, they're going to hit the rock. And then they slide along the rock and then hit you. So just give them the respect they deserve. The pigs are very scary and dangerous. And again, they also have high movement speed with some affixes, and then they can keep up with you, and then they'll start thrashing in melee range. So you just want to kind of focus these and the treants. I would just kite the treants, kill everything else, and then kill the treants on their own. And then for the pig chargers, just try to like get some space. Toro, Matador, be very aware because they can get pretty scary. And I think that covers most of the scariest mob types in the entire game. Hopefully this is a pretty exhaustive list for people that are wondering or curious or needed some help with surviving in the game, passing on some knowledge there. There are a few things that I missed, but the video is already way longer than I intended. So hopefully this was useful for you. If you did find value in it, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm. Helps this video get seen by more people. And of course, come by my live stream if you like to hang out, or if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them there. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.